Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Leeson here, today's top stories. MPs say white working class children have been neglected for decades, with terms like white privilege making things worse. The Health Secretary says fully vaccinated Brits could be exempt from quarantine returning from an amber list country. And 2 England first team footballers are out of tonight's match after contact with a Scotland player who tested positive. MPs say white working class pupils have been let down for decades by England's education system. They say the use of the phrase white privilege in schools isn't helping. Here's NTD's Jane Well with more.
A report from the Education Committee says white working class students are one of the worst achieving groups in the country. It says the term white privilege in schools is causing problems because for disadvantaged white children, the opposite is true. MPs say the working class white pupils have been let down and neglected by the education system. In 2018 to 19, the proportion of working class British pupils going to higher education was 16%, the lowest of any ethnic group other than Irish heritage and Gypsy Roma pupils. The challenges are complex and are both economic and cultural. MPs have several proposals, including targeted funding, making sure vocational training is available, attracting good teachers and finding a better way to talk about racial disparities. The chair of the committee says the term white privilege is divisive and pits one group against another, and questioned if using such politically controversial terms in schools is consistent with the Equality Act. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
The government is planning to drop quarantine restrictions when returning from amber list countries for people who are fully vaccinated. NTD's David English brings us this story.
Health Secretary Matt Hancock says fully vaccinated Brits could be exempt from quarantine upon returning home from an amber list country. He says this hasn't been clinically advised, but he is in favour of replacing quarantine with daily testing.
We're working on plans to essentially allow the vaccine to bring back some of the freedoms that have had to be restricted to keep people safe.
Hancock says the government is going to make sure Brits who are fully vaccinated can prove it to other countries, and there will be restrictions on international travel to protect the UK.
We have one of the tightest border control systems in the world, and we have that because we want to protect this amazing progress we've made at home with the vaccination programme.
The Health Secretary tells BBC Radio 4 that the government hopes to offer COVID and flu jabs at the same time. He says almost nobody had flu in the last 18 months, but experts are braced for a bad winter. He says the NHS is preparing for a very significant flu vaccination drive this winter. People might get a COVID booster jab and flu jab at the same time. Hancock also says he hopes there will be no further lockdowns in the cooler months. David English, NTD News.
A bill on protests arouses controversy as a parliamentary committee describes it as inconsistent with human rights and deeply concerning. NTD's Neil Woodrow brings us the details.
This controversial bill will curb non-violent protest in a way that is inconsistent with human rights, a group of MPs and peers are warning. Demonstrations have been held in cities around England in response to the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, amid fears that it would curtail the right to protest. Parliament's Joint Committee on Human Rights flags concerns about the proposed law and calls for some clauses to be removed. The committee's report says a new noise trigger for conditions on protest is neither necessary nor proportionate and should be deleted. The committee says protesters gather together to get their voices heard, so the new ban would disproportionately impact your typical demonstrations. It also recommends dropping powers to impose conditions on one-person protests and clauses that increase penalties for breaching conditions placed on protests. Committee Chair Labour MP Harriet Harman says we are calling for the right to protest peacefully to be given explicit statutory protection. A Home Office spokeswoman says the proposed measures are in line with human rights law and will enable police to better manage demonstrations. Neil Woodrow, NTD News, Westminster, London.
2 England players have to self-isolate after close contact with a Scotland player. But the whole Scotland team that share a dressing room with him don't. NTD's Joy Duguid brings us this report.
England footballers Ben Chilwell and Mason Mount are self-isolating. That's despite regular tests coming out negative for the virus.
So the mandatory tests yesterday for the pre-game, and we've just followed that up today because of the situation that's emerged with Scotland, just as a sort of belt and braces really, to make sure that we're okay for people to travel together and eat together.
Chilwell and Mount were seen hugging Chelsea teammate and Scotland midfielder Billy Gilmour after the final whistle of Friday's England-Scotland game. Gilmour tested positive for COVID-19 on Monday. Public Health England worked with the Football Association to work out who were close contacts of Gilmour, but none of Gilmour's Scotland teammates were identified as close contacts. So the Scotland team will not have to isolate. England coach Gareth Southgate appeared puzzled at the different approaches.
Yeah, look, I don't want to cause a drama for Scotland, but if you're all in the dressing room together, where does everything stand?
Chilwell and Mount will isolate until next Monday and miss Tuesday's game against Czech Republic. England and Czech Republic have 4 points each, so a draw would see both go through to the knockout stage. But Scotland face a tough challenge from 2018 World Cup runners-up Croatia. Coach Steve Clarke admits missing Gilmour is a blow, but is a chance for his replacement.
The only spanner that throws into the works that Billy would have started the game and now he won't, so it's a chance for someone else to come into the team and make themselves the national hero.
The Croatians and the Scots both have 1 point and need a win to stay in the competition. Joy Duguid, NTD News.
The government have announced that they are increasing capacity at Wembley to more than 60,000 fans for the semi-finals and final of Euro 2020. The new levels mean the stadium will be at 75% capacity for the final 3 games of the competition, which concludes on July 11th. And in other news, the Mayor of London says passengers on the tube will be able to use their mobile phones underground by the end of 2024. Permanent phone reception was made available on some sections for the first time last year. Sadiq Khan had promised to deliver 4G throughout the tube network on condition of his re-election for a second term as London Mayor. Transport for London says some of the capital's busiest stations will be fully connected by the end of next year. That includes Oxford Circus, Tottenham Court Road and Bank. And in other news, the government says it has begun negotiations to join a Trans-Pacific trade deal, which ministers say is crucial to expanding Britain's trade relations around the world after Brexit. Eddie Aiken has this report.
Britain's Trade Secretary Liz Truss made a formal request in February to join the CPTPP, or Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Membership of the trade bloc removes 95% of tariffs between its members. It's currently made up of 11 countries including Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia and Vietnam. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who is in Vietnam for a meeting of Asian and European leaders, says the deal will bring economic benefits to all sides.
And I think joining the CPTPP will provide a boost economically for all sides. It's a high-quality, win-win multilateral trade deal. But it's also a boost to the principle of free trade as we work with others to try and help shape and reinforce future trading rules.
The British government sees joining the partnership as an important part of efforts to reduce reliance on trade with the EU and develop new relations with fast-growing economies in other parts of the world. Raab will also visit Cambodia and Singapore on his tour of Asia. Following the government's review of its foreign and defence policy, Britain is aiming to strengthen its position in the Indo-Pacific region, partly in response to China's growing influence. Eddie Aiken, NTD News.
60 parliamentarians urged the United Nations to investigate the Chinese regime's alleged genocide against Uyghur Muslims ahead of its Human Rights Council meeting. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Sharon Shu explains more.
over 60 parliamentarians from 18 different parliaments issued an open statement calling for the UN to launch a commission of inquiry into the alleged genocide of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. This comes on the heels of G7 summit highlighting abuses against the Uyghurs and urging China to respect human rights. While the Chinese embassy in the UK calls the accusations baseless, experts generally agree that the Chinese regime has detained up to 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims and subjected them to various abuses. The Chinese state has also been accused of forced cultural assimilation and coerced sterilization against the Uyghurs. In October last year, 39 countries at the UN expressed grave concerns over China's abuses. The Chinese state has recently come under increasing pressure from the international community on the origins of the CCP virus, also known as coronavirus. This call will further strain the relations between China and the democratic West. Sharon Xu, NTD News.
And in other news, a mechanic in Norfolk got a surprise on Monday when he discovered a python under the bonnet of a car. It was a Sunfire Royal Bull python measured more than 1 meter long. It was found curled up on top of the engine when the car was brought in for an MOT. Mechanic Chris Newell made the discovery while at work. The snake belonged to the 9-year-old stepson of the vehicle's owner, having escaped from its tank a fortnight earlier. The car's owner said she thought the garage was winding her up when they rang about the hidden passenger. And in other news, Germany's antitrust watchdog is taking a closer look at Apple. The Cartel office wants to know if the tech giant is exploiting its market power. NTD's Evelyn Lee brings us the latest.
Apple is facing closer scrutiny from Germany's antitrust watchdog. The Cartel office said it launched an investigation into whether the tech giant is exploiting its market position. The president of the Federal Cartel Office says they're investigating all elements. That includes Apple hardware, the Apple Store, Apple Music, and Apple Arcade.
We're investigating whether all of these elements taken together create a kind of independent economic system that makes it extremely difficult for other companies to go up against.
Under recent reforms to Germany's competition laws, the watchdog gained enhanced powers. It's now making use of them to open investigations into Google, Facebook, and Amazon over their data practices. Mund says they're investigating two things. One is whether they really have an impact on competition, and secondly, if they're hindering fair competition that leads to customer disadvantage.
If you look at Facebook, for example, where the consumer has to agree to Facebook accessing all their data, this is part of our investigation.
The watchdog says it has received more complaints about Apple and is considering further proceedings against the tech giant. Apple allegedly gives itself preferential treatment by pre-installing its own applications.
Our aim is to put an end to elements which are not fair to competition, so that companies have to behave differently in the future and become more fair, and opening up the market.
An Apple spokesperson said the company's App Store has given German developers of all sizes the same opportunity. Evelyn Lee, NTD News.
A German company publicly demonstrates its electric flying taxi. Volocopter plans to have a full service in operation for the public by 2024. NTD's Joy Duguid has more on the story.
German company Volocopter wants to have an electric air taxi service up and running in 3 years' time. On Monday, it conducted its first public flight demonstration in France at an air show near Paris. The air taxi, called Velocity, took off and landed vertically over the Bourget airport during a 3-minute remote flight. The CEO explains the business model.
We do not sell Velocities to individual persons. In the city of the future, these will be shared assets that are professionally operated as a fleet. So you as a customer can then call a Velocity to come and pick you up when you need it, and you only pay for the flight.
He says he expects with increasing volume an air taxi ride will come at the cost of a regular taxi ride. The Velocity looks like a tiny helicopter and is powered by 9 removable batteries. Each taxi has a luggage compartment and can seat 2 people.
The market potential for these services is gigantic. We estimate that by 2035, we can serve a market that has around $300 billion in opportunity, just with air taxis.
Reuters says the flying taxi service would first operate with a licensed pilot, but he expects it will eventually be fully automated. Joy Duguid, NTD News.
Still to come, the German military recently recruited its first rabbi in over a century. Find out more after the break.